Good evening and a warm welcome to yet another biography event. My name is Kai Bird and I have the pleasure of serving as director of the Leon Levy Center for Biography, a wholly unique institution hosted by the Graduate Center of the City University of New York and founded by Shelby White and the Leon Levy Foundation in the year 2007. I want to thank Shelby for her steadfast support to the Biography Center. It is her vision that makes this program possible. Please note that our next event will take place on Tuesday, May 28th at 6:30 p.m. with the celebrated British author, Nicholas Shakespeare. And yes, he claims to be a relative of that Shakespeare. I will be talking with Nick about his biography of Ian Fleming, the spy master, and the James Bond novelist. This in-person event will take place here in the Skylight room, but it will also be live streamed, as is this event. But tonight I'm delighted to introduce the critically acclaimed author, Paul Hendrickson. I will be in conversation with Paul about his magically written memoir of his father fighting the night, Iwo Jima, World War II, and a flyer's life. Paul Hendrickson is a three-time finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award and a winner of it once for his 2003 Sons of Mississippi. His The Living and the Dead, Robert McNamara, and Five Lies of a Lost War was a 1996 finalist for the National Book Award. His 2011 Hemingway's Boat was both a New York Times and London bestseller. He has been the recipient of writing fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation, the National Endowment for the Arts, the Lyndhurst Foundation, and the Elisa Patterson Foundation. Since 1998, he's been on the faculty of the Creative Writing Program at the University of Pennsylvania, and for 2 decades before that, he was a staff writer at the Washington Post. He lives with his wife, Cecilia, a retired nurse, outside Philadelphia and in Washington, D.C. Please look for his books at bookshops.org, a site that will lead you to your local independent bookstore. But tonight we also have books for sale in the lobby, courtesy of Books on Call NYC over there. Paul and I will be in conversation for 40 minutes or so, and then we will take questions from our live audience. We will try to end this program after about 1 hour. Again, thanks to the Leon Levy Foundation for funding this and all our events. So, Paul, I want to begin. You say that this book has been simmering, you use that word, for at least half a century. But it is a memoir. Is it a memoir or is it a biography of your father? What's the difference?
Oh boy, that's a great question, and when I figure it out, I'll tell you. I call it a reported memoir. I'll just in a minute try to say a little more about that, but I asked Kai on the way in if I could just make some acknowledgments and thank yous right here at the start, and I'll just take a detour and do that. So many of my books seem to take a detour, take a tangent. This is a happy one. This is a 4-generation book. My father, my generation, myself, my siblings, my 2 sons, one of whom is here tonight, and my grandsons, to whom this book is dedicated, Jackson and Teddy Hendrickson. So it is certainly coming down the male side of the story. But I want to say something about the women. My mother is very much a character in this story. She waited out the war like how many untold thousands of war wives did, and we can talk about that. But I mean specifically some women. My great, I'm embarrassing her, literary agent, Kathy Robbins, is here. She's in the room. And she is a mensch, a mom, and I think the most esteemed literary agent in New York, with a little bit of bias from me. But her office mates are here. All three of them are women. So the female side of the Robbins agency is here. My daughter-in-law, Liz, is here, wife of our son, John, who is in the room. But most of all, if I'm thinking of females and women, actually, wait a minute, I see in the room some beloved old students. Anjali just came in, just slipped in. I don't know when we studied together, worked together at UPenn, Anjali, but I saw your face and instantly recognized it, and others too. So I'm thinking of the feminine side of fighting the night at the moment, and there's no person in this room I wish to thank more than my wife, Paul Hendrickson, who is here tonight, who has helped incredibly with every book that I have written, and none of them would have gotten written without her. A very quick story, when I was working on my first book, which was a reported memoir, so this kind of bookends and circles around. That first book was an account of my Catholic seminary upbringing. In my wayward boyhood, I went away to study for the Catholic priesthood at age 14, and decades later tried to write a book about it and did, and it was published 41 years ago in 1983. My wife, Seal, we were married then, and that was the first book struggle she endured, gave me a gray t-shirt, which still exists and is tacked to the wall as you go up to the third floor loft of our home, and it says, "Caution, book in progress." On the next book, she upped the ante, and it said, "Just say no to books." But she didn't mean that. So all of the females in this room, as well as all of the rest of you, thank you for coming. Boy, is this a biography or is this a memoir? It's both, I think. I know we're at the Leon Levy Center for Biography. It's part autobiographical. I mean, I'm much in the story. It's my father's story, a man I knew for 59 years, in another way, didn't know at all. And that's what this book represents, a son's search for his father. It's very much a book about World War II, but in a larger way, it's not even about World War II. It's about a son searching for his father. So, Kai, I had to kind of go out into the world to discover the truths in my own heart. I certainly went to archives, military archives, all over the place. That's
Got lucky with some documents that otherwise should have, might have been burned in that terrible warehouse fire in Missouri, right?
Kai is referencing. Can I take one quick more detour? I'm here tonight, side by side, with Kai Bird. I'm embarrassing you now. Kai Bird's book, American Prometheus, the Oppenheimer biography, he asked me in his office a few minutes ago to sign a copy of Fighting the Night for him. And you know what I wrote? For Kai, who sets the standard for us all. That beautiful, beautiful book, which he co-wrote with Martin Sherwin, who is no longer alive, that is the pillar of biographies, if you ask me. And along comes Christopher Nolan making this movie that only has earned billions. I heard Christopher Nolan, when he accepted the Academy Award, speak Kai's name and speak American Prometheus. So I am beyond honored to be here with you tonight, and I know that embarrasses you. And not only that book, but your other biographies, most recently of Jimmy Carter, but back when you were writing for The Nation in the early 80s, and I was a scribe at the Washington Post. Kai and I kind of circled each other. We never quite knew each other as friends. But later in the Vietnam period, we both really felt indebted to William Conrad Gibbons. But is it a biography or is it a memoir? It's both and it's neither nor. It's certainly great parts memoir, but it's biography and it's research. I'm not about to say, Kai, it's a new literary form. No, it's a reported memoir, and I think...
reported memoir. Well, let me take a detour. One of the things that I had the good fortune to do in my 7 years now as the director of the Leon Levy Center was to found a master's program in biography and memoir. And we did this with the great skepticism of the university authorities who thought that no one would come, no one would sign up for this. And in fact, there are now 60+ students enrolled in this program. Most of them, I think, are actually doing memoir, family memoir, memoirs about their father. And it's a very live genre. It's very compelling. And it's sort of a relative of biography, right?
Yeah.
But there is a lot of interest in this, and I think your book, this book in particular, precisely because it's a blend of biography and memoir, will be of intense interest to these students.
Kai mentioned a disastrous fire in 1973 at the National Personnel Records Center in St. Louis. This is where all of the military records of American servicemen were held, and in 1973 they lost something, they don't know the exact percentage, maybe 70% of those records were destroyed. So when I started out on this book, and I had heard about this fire, I had lived in St. Louis actually, not in 1973, I got a hold of the National Personnel Records Center, which is part of the National Archives system. And they said, well, we can get back to you in a week. And they got back to me. A woman called me on the phone, and she said, your father's full file is here and fully intact. And so as soon...
It's a miracle.
I mean, when I got out there, I thought maybe the edges of the paper would be singed or something. I remember I was out there for 3 days, Xeroxing wildly, madly. That's the research, that's the archival, that's just one. But I asked that question, in between times when I was taking, why did my dads get saved? No one had a reasonable answer. They said, well, maybe it was on a shelf somewhere that particular day. But I almost felt, I think I felt it before then, because it had been simmering on the back of my eyeball for 50 years while other books got written and other journalism got done. But I almost felt when I was told that, yes, your father's file is intact, that I had no choice but to write this book. Can I tell you a very funny story about when I opened the file for the first time? There, as the top document, in a file that was this big, I'm not exaggerating, it was this big. It had all of his service records that I was able to track. The first item was a letter from my grandmother that was legendary in our family. When I was a kid, I had heard about this letter. My grandmother, Nana, sat down at a farm table in Xenia, Ohio, and wrote to Eleanor Roosevelt and said, "Dear Mrs. Roosevelt, my son-in-law, newly married to my daughter, they are expecting their first child. They've only been married a couple of months. I'm asking you to intervene with your husband that my son-in-law not be sent overseas to the war. That letter, including stamps, was the first, in not a copy, the actual letter written in Nana's scriggly blue hand. I can picture her late at night at her farm table kitchen, furiously writing to Eleanor Roosevelt. She was a force of nature. Well, it didn't work, as you can imagine. My father was sent overseas, but a couple weeks later, coming to Xenia, Ohio, was a letter from some major journal in the adjutant's office. Dear Mrs. Kine, we have your letter here, and thank you very much, and we understand your concern, but we cannot promise that your son-in-law will not be sent to the war zones. I saw that letter, and I started hooting. Every other researcher in the reading room sort of, did a double take. What is this guy laughing about? I could not believe Nana's letter was the first one in the pile.
So that brings us to Morgansfield, Kentucky. This is really a book in part about your roots in Kentucky, your family's history there, your father's escape from Kentucky, let's say. I mean, it's a different world, right?
I feel like that chapter is entitled Long Ago in Kentucky. And it's taken from an epigraph, part of a poem by Robert Penn Warren. Can I read a few lines of the poem because it's so beautiful? When I saw this poem, this too felt like the 1973 information that your father's file is intact. I saw this poem many years ago. Long ago in Kentucky, I, a boy, stood by a dirt road in first dark and heard the great geese hoot northward. I could not see them, there being no moon and the stars sparse. I heard them. I did not know what was happening in my heart. Tell me a story. In this century and moment of mania, tell me a story. Make it a story of great distances and starlight. The great distances my father went was from Morganfield, Kentucky, about 8,500 miles deep into the Pacific, to Iwo Jima. Kai's question about my dad growing up, he was a sharecropper's son in the 1930s. He grew up on a farm in western Kentucky, Union County, Kentucky, 9 children. He was the third born. When I used to go down there as a boy and ride on the tractors. When I began researching this book, only one son was alive. There were eight sons and 1 daughter. And, my father was born in 1918, so he would be 106 if he were sitting here today. But my Uncle Lonnie was alive, and he was 90. He was the youngest son. And I remember one of the things he said a few years ago. He said, Paul, I can tell you one thing. We didn't go barefoot. Daddy put shoes on our feet. We didn't go barefoot. My father grew up just absolute dirt poor, walking to school. And when he got to high school, he rode a horse. He rode a horse to high school. And in 1937, he enlisted in the Army Air Corps. We were 4 years and some from entering World War II. In 1937, it was a peacetime army. He was a high school graduate who had almost literally never been out of the county in which he was born. And he rode a bus up into Illinois to Chanute Field in Rantoul, Illinois, enlisted in the Army Air Corps in mechanic school. Then the war comes on. And he eventually was able to apply for high school and married my mother. And when he went off to war, to Iwo Jima, late in the war, he was 25, and my mother was just a few years out of her teens. When they got married in Xenia, Ohio. My mother was barely 19, and when they went off to war, when he went off to war and she went home to her parents, there were 2 babies on her hip, one of whom was me. I was 5 months old. So it is partly a story of great distances and starlight. One of the things that moves me most as a son is the distance, a leap almost, of space and time that my father made from this know-nothing Kentucky boy sitting on wagon tongues looking up at crop dusters and thinking, I want to fly airplanes, to flying this P-61 Black Widow on Iwo Jima, and then later having a 30-year Eastern Airlines career. I mean, I don't know about the generation above you, your father, but you know, the leap my dad made is still gives me goosebumps, and I can say that unabashedly.
So at one point you quote your father saying to you, you know, Paul, all of my troubles begin once I get back down on the ground. And this prompts me to ask you about the father-son relationship, which I gather was quite difficult. You actually, as a young man, a young boy, feared your father. Let's get into that difficult part of the memoir.
Like I would think many sons in this room who have fathers, of course, or who had fathers, I've spent a great part of my life trying to reassemble the life of a man I feared and was in awe of for, as I said, nearly 60 years. I don't think I'm alone in making a statement like that. My father did say that to me once. He said, this is very hard for me to say, but I think he was happiest up there in his wild blue yonder. And he said, all my problems begin when I get back down on the ground. My parents were married for 61 years. And I have to say, it was a largely sorrowful marriage. They were Catholic. There was no question. There was no possibility they could get divorced or even separate. It wasn't in the framework that they came from. Which is not to say that there wasn't tenderness and loyalty and decency there at points. But my father came from this tradition where violence was in the family. And my older brother and I, my older brother's not living, we were terrified of my father. And I don't think it is, as much as we loved him, as much as we admired him, as much as we sought his approval, on the other hand, we were terrified of him. I mean, I now understand he came home from the war with PTSD, and it took him 10 years to exorcise those demons. And I think he took a lot of them out savagely on his sons' backs with his belt. I don't think it's a mystery that my older brother Marty, 18 months older than I am, fled into this Catholic seminary right out of 8th grade, and I followed 2 years later. In one sense, we were trying to outrun my father's wrath. I came to have, I mean, this book is about searching for that and trying to understand that. And I mean, who ever heard of PTSD in the 50s growing up? We didn't have that language. And from everything I know, he rose to be a captain on Eastern Airlines, and he did his job professionally and very well. And if I am speaking a little darkly right now, I will say that when he died, he showed me how to die. He died of a tumor in his stomach and an unfixable heart condition. And I was in the room in Tampa, Florida, when the doctor came in and said, Joe, And he admired my father because he knew about my father's career, flying this airplane, flying big commercial jets out of Chicago. And the doctor said, Joe, I know you like it straight, so here's the straight. We cannot operate on the tumor in your stomach because your heart would never take it. So Joe, there's not really any chance. And it was as if my father was being briefed in the ready room on Iwo Jima for his next intruder mission. Before the doctor had the final words out of his mouth, my dad said, yes, all right, I get it, I understand. And my older brother, my younger brother and I got him out of the hospital that day and got him into a hospice, and he died 8 days later. He was showing us in those 8 days, his last 8 days, how to die, how to honor an obligation, all through my childhood. If we were outrunning his wrath, we were also learning by example how to live up to your responsibilities. I'm talking too much.
So, no, let me pick up on that. He returned from the war angry, sometimes violent, injured in some way. So let's talk about what happened in the war. He was assigned eventually to pilot this very special airplane. Describe the P-61 Black Widow and what it was designed for.
I wonder if anybody in here has heard of the Black Widow. It's kind of a mythic airplane. There are only 4 in existence. When the war was over, they shoved them off aircraft carriers and tossed them down mountains. They were expendable metal. They couldn't bring them home. There are 4 in existence, called the Black Widow, with a twin-boom fuselage, a 3-man ship. It was a hybrid airplane. It was a fighter-bomber. It wasn't a fighter, it wasn't a bomber. It was a combination of both. It had an amazing speed. It could climb and descend. It was armed to the oarlocks with armament. It had 4 50 caliber machine guns. It had rockets. It had 20-millimeter cannons. It had 500-pound bombs dangling beneath its wings. As I have said in the book, it was like a small, tight orchestra of violence. It was a 3-man ship. My dad, the pilot, the gunner who sat right above him, and the radar man in the back. They flew in pitch black conditions. This plane was flying around the dark of the Pacific in pitch of night. The missions were always at night. He flew 75 missions, about 175 hours of logged time. A lot of the missions were defensive in nature. They were circling Iwo Jima, looking for stray enemy invaders. Some of the missions, however, were intruder missions to Japanese-held islands, 100 miles away, 150 miles away, islands called Chichi-jima, Ha-ha-jima, and he would strafe and bomb. And he had some very, very close calls, which, Kai, I was able to get the documentary record. I was able to get the old mission reports. That was magical.
So 6 days after landing on... 6 days after landing on Iwo Jima, he falls asleep in his tent, and in the middle of the night, a horde of Japanese soldiers run through the encampment, killing people right and left, and he, by pure chance, survives. Describe that attack and actually give us a portrait of the Japanese officer who organized it, who turns out to be this extraordinary Japanese officer who is very familiar with America.
Does anyone remember Clint Eastwood's movie Letters from Iwo Jima? About 20 years ago. Eastwood says it's one of his favorite movies of the 40 or 50 that he has made. It is telling the story of Iwo Jima entirely from the Japanese side. Tadamichi Kurabashi was his name. What an amazing figure. I obsessively got into his life, and I understood at the end that it was just another way of trying to understand my own father, because in letters from Iwo Jima, he was constantly writing back to his family in Tokyo. All of my parents' letters got destroyed. They didn't survive my family's many moves. So we don't have letters between my mother and father from the war. My mother wrote to my father every day he was overseas. And he was on Iwo Jima for 5.5 months. He was overseas in Hawaii and Saipan, so he was gone a year or more. And my father wrote to my mother every 3 or 4 days. All those letters are gone. But the letters of this Japanese general, here is the moment that those letters survive. Here's the moment Kai is describing. Yes, my father faced in the pitch of night these very scary moments. This one night he got trapped in the searchlights in a place called Chichijima that was supposed to be, pissant searchlights, except he got up there and he said, Paul, I could have read a newspaper in the cockpit. He said, Paul, it was like an operating room in the cockpit. And he's whirring and swooping and ack is going off everywhere. But the moment Kai is describing was on the ground. And it was 6 days after he and his convoy arrived on Iwo Jima. My dad arrived in the 3rd week of March, 1945, just about 15 days after the Marines raised the flag on Mount Suribachi. I see the nods. You know that photograph. You can squint. That photograph, like this book hanging on the back of my eyeball half a century, that photograph, it's hanging on the back of your eyeball. So the island was supposedly secure. Would that it were true. Maybe as many as 600 Japanese soldiers made a last-ditch suicide stand, and they came out of the caves and bunkers. And my father's squadron, my father's bivouac, the pitched tents, were right in the red, dead center of it. And here's what happened. This incredibly fascinating figure, General Kurabashi, Tadamichi Kurabashi, he hated the idea of a banzai suicide. He thought that was just a waste of human life. What he planned was a kirakomi, which it's a strategic suicide mission. They had plotted out where they thought the flyers' tents were, the officers' tents. The enlisted men were over here in their rows of tents, and the officers, the flyers, were over here. A distance from that wall to that wall, maybe even less. My father said a distance of 30 yards. So at 4 a.m., screaming and yelling, with sabers, the tents are being slashed open and grenades are being rolled in. My father had a .45 Luger. He wasn't trained for that kind of hand-to-hand combat. He's holding his gun out like this, waiting at any minute for a maniacal face to appear. His tent got slashed open, but the deaths occurred on the other side, 30 yards away. What I like to think, and that was 6 days after he was on Iwo Jima, the Marines came in with their flamethrowers and destroyed. And there's one photograph in here that is so hard to look at. About 15 bodies, Japanese bodies, are in a ditch. Some of them don't have heads. Unless my father had a bandana tied around his eyes, there's no possible way he could have exited his tent in daylight and not seen these ditches that were all around the 549th Squadron compound. That's the kind of thing he came home from the war with. The great Michael Hare, who wrote Dispatches, which is about Vietnam, I think the greatest single book about Vietnam is Michael Hare's Dispatches. This past Saturday, the Wall Street Journal ran a review of this book, and above the fold, above the review, they ran this quote by Michael Hare, which I do reproduce in the book. It's about Vietnam, but it's about all men in all wars. And here is the quote. I couldn't carry Michael Hare's water. The first time I wrote a book about Vietnam, but Michael Hare is the great Vietnam. So the quote is this. Is it possible they were there and not haunted? No, not possible.
So I was struck at one point you say that almost 1/3 of the U.S. Marines killed in all of World War II died in Iwo Jima. 1/3 of the U.S. Marines.
Do you believe that? This little scrap of sulfurous sand, 760 miles south of Tokyo, 8 miles long and 4 miles wide at its widest point. This little scrap of sand. 1/3 of all Marine casualties occurred in the taking of Vietnam, which has something to do, I think, with my father's reluctance to talk to me about what he did in the war. Only 4 or 5 or 6 times in my life did I ever get him to talk about it. I think there was a part of me that desperately wanted him to talk about it, and there was a part of me that didn't want to hear it, let alone see a picture like that, which he never, ever mentioned that photograph. But the title of that chapter is called Clear Pictures. That picture never left him. That photograph never left him. Kai, Iwo Jima is the only battle in the Pacific where the American casualties were greater than the Japanese casualties. More Japanese actually died on Iwo Jima, but the total casualties of Americans were exceeded. So even today, there are these fierce arguments. Was the taking of Iwo Jima remotely worth the strategic gain?
Yeah, it's a question. I don't think there's a clear answer, is there?
The reason they wanted to take Iwo Jima was this. The B-17s the B-17s were making the big bombing runs on Japan. They were way down in Saipan. They had the fuel and the engines to go that distance. Iwo was right in the middle. Saipan is 1,500 miles south. If you can take Iwo, you've got a landing base for crippled bombers coming back. And you also have a landing base to make attacks on Iwo Jima. I told a story the other night. Again, this was part of the discovery, part of the archival discovery. At the end of the war, the wise generals, before the bombs were dropped that ended the war, first on Hiroshima and then on Nagasaki 6 days later, and then the war is over. Right on the eve of that, the wise heads commanding the Pacific forces were going to send Black Widow squadrons based on Iwo Jima to make bombing runs on Tokyo. My dad's airplane was not that kind of an airplane. It was intensely maneuverable. It could do its job in patches of ocean superbly, but it was not equipped to go 760 miles this way and 760 miles back, even if you put beneath its wings extra fuel tanks called drop tanks. I mean, he wouldn't have made it back. He was picked to go, and the war ended. So like that moment where the tents got slashed open and a distance of 30 yards saved his life because the real killing was over there, I think that the fact that he didn't have to go on a bombing run to Japan saved. It's the reason I'm sitting on the 9th floor. Well, no, I was born, and I might have been able to sit on the 9th floor of the Levy Center, but my kid brother and sister would not.
So, Paul, let's switch a little bit to the nature of the book. It's beautifully written. It's just very carefully crafted. The words sing. It's like poetry. You also sprinkle through the entire book many photographs, and I was struck by the fact that you dissect each of those photographs in the way that like a Susan Sontag would dissect a photograph. You looked at, and I was astonished. I would look at the photo, and I only after reading your analysis of the photo in question would I see what you had pointed out. And it's like a detective, you were looking at the photos for these little clues. Tell us about that process.
Well, I'd rather have Takani come to the front of the room. Or Anjali come to the front of the room. They took a course at the University of Pennsylvania, which I started teaching this course. I inaugurated this course about 15 years ago, called The Hungry Eye, telling stories out of photographs. Takani wrote beautifully about, he walked back into some family photographs. Anjali walked back into some family photographs. Gabe walked back into some family photographs. I don't know. I mean, I've made my answers too long, so why don't I make this short? My brain seems to think visually. And once I discovered the storytelling power that exists between the four walls, inside this rectangle, if you could almost literally step back into it and research it and dream your way into it, Anjali, do you remember the old formula? Fact plus memory plus imagination will render you the big M, meaning. I put it on the board like an Einstein equation. F plus M plus I equals M, meaning. Fact plus memory plus imagination. So I get the kids to walk back into them. I can remember right now a father-son photograph that you wrote about, Takani. I'm embarrassing you. Here's Matt Flegenheimer. What am I saying? Matt Flegenheimer, a great writer for the New York Times. You know his byline. He's a graduate of that damn course. Fleg, get up here and take my place, will you?
So, Paul, I have one final question for you before we're going to open it up to the audience for questions. First, exactly how long did it take you to write this book? I know it was germinating, but once you got that file from the Personnel Records Office, how long did it take you to actually do the research and write the book? And then finally, in the end, do you think you really know your father in a way that you didn't before you began the book?
Kai, you've asked such potent questions. I say again, I'm the deepest admirer of Kai Bird's work. I think he does set the standard for us all. And by the way, if he writes these true biographies, in which he sort of keeps the first person out. You crossing Mandelbaum's gate.
I wrote a memoir.
He wrote a memoir. He can do it. And there was reporting in that, right?
A lot of reporting. Footnotes.
Yeah. This book simmered on the back of my eyeball for half a century. That's not an exaggeration. In 1982, I got my dad to go to a Night Fighters convention in Orlando. He was not a convention guy. He was not a reunion guy. And he went because he knew his Washington Post son was dying for him to go, and he went as a favor to me. And he would introduce me to these old cronies that he flew with. And he would always say, "Oh, this is my son. He's a writer for the Washington Post. Never trust a damn thing a writer says, and don't tell him anything." But he was very secretly and not so secretly proud to have me down there with him. And he knew that someday, when he wasn't here, I would struggle with this book. Kai, the book, as any book you have written, it mutated and gestated and took different forms. I always in my, you might say, walking dreams, this book was back there. But literally, to answer your question, once I sat down and began it, after the previous book, which was published only 5 years ago in 2019, it was a book about Frank Lloyd Wright, it somehow or other, maybe the book was so simmering for all that time that I did not get blocked. I'm famous for getting blocked. And you would think a book like this is tailor-made for getting blocked. All of your father-son ghosts, all of your father-son demons. But I am not about to say I wrote it straight out, Kai, but it came a lot faster. It came a lot faster. Now, the hardest answer to your beautiful three-pronged question, do I think I know who my father really was? And the answer is no. I think I know parts of him better, and I think I understand why he did certain things better, but there will always be that certain mystery there, and that sadness there, really, when he, I mean, that quote, you found it when he said, Paul, all my problems begin when I get back down on the ground.
That's such a sad thing for him to say.
And yet I would, deep into his 70s, he was still flying. He was long retired from Eastern Airlines. At the age of 59, he could no longer pass the physical. The Hendrickson genes tend to have bad hearts, and so in those days, there was early retirement at 60 and mandatory at 65. He was done at 59, even though he did 30 years flying out of O'Hare and Midway, two intense airports. I would fly with him in his little private plane deep into his 70s in awe of what he could do. Nearly till he died, he had 20/20 vision in both eyes. His heart had been failing for a decade. He would come to our home in Tacoma Park, Maryland. He would still find a way to take the stairs 2 at a time. He never let his belly go flabby in the way of old retired pilots. These are the things that I'm saying that are these examples that are there. Do I know my father better? Yes, no, and in between. I wish I knew him better. I'm not about to try to write a sequel.
Okay. On that note, let's have a few questions from the audience.
That's for you.
Thank you very much for a really interesting and emotional talk. If you'd made that call to Missouri and they'd gotten back to you...
Could I ask you to speak up just a little? My old fading hearing, and maybe lower the microphone just a little.
If you'd made that call to Missouri and they'd said, sorry, the file was destroyed in the fire, would you have written a book, a different book, but a book, or would it have been impossible?
Ma'am, I take my hat off to that question. Thank you. That is such a... Would I have tried to write it despite? if that file never existed. It would have been a different book. I mean, I'm the sort of a writer who cannot seem to get to first base unless I have the facts. I really am driven by the facts, and then I try to turn the facts into something that is half-assed lyrical. I think I was possessed enough by the idea of wanting to know my father that I would have tried in some way. I mean, the 4 or 5 or 6 times that I got him to talk about it, those were, and he talked about it in code. That suicide night, I knew something about that. He called it the raid, but I mean, I didn't begin to know how close his life almost. And I remember him saying, "Oh, the night I got trapped in the searchlights." Thank you for that beautiful question, and I don't have a clear answer for it except what I know about myself. You see, here's one thing, and there's a lot of, I can look around and see a handful of true writers in this room I know are practicing their craft. I don't know if they would agree with me, but one of the things, and this sounds, I don't mean this to sound mumbo jumbo, all mystical on you, all Zen or something on you, but I feel that we don't choose our projects, they choose us.
You've spoken very eloquently about renewing your relationship with your father. How did this book help you renew your relationship with you 50 years ago? With you 50 years ago. In other words, with your younger self.
With your younger self.
Oh, come to terms with my younger self writing this book.
Who first wanted to write this book.
Another memoir. Your first book was a memoir.
Someone said, not someone, a great writer, journalist, David Marinis, interviewed me 2 nights ago, exactly the beautiful questions, kinds of questions that Kai is asking at Politics and Prose in Washington, which is kind of our home base bookstore. And he talked about this idea. He said, now, I'm not saying you're done, Paul. He said, but your first book, 41 years ago, was Seminary, A Search. By the way, I think every book I've ever written could be subtitled A Search. That book is literally entitled Seminary, A Search. And this book kind of bookends I'm still trying to search for all of the things that I think that I understood back then and have little windows of insight better now, but it's one foot after another, one struggle after another. Auden, W.H. Auden said, "The thing I cannot find is known to my unconscious mind."
Another question.
Here's the microphone, sir.
My father served in World War II. He was in the 82nd Airborne Division, and had a couple of jumps and things like that. But he wrote a book, and I really felt I got to know him a lot better by reading the book. There are things about him that I do remember from childhood, but this really rounded out my picture of him, and he served in about 6 different combat operations. He wound up at the end of the war. He was in Germany on and the Russians essentially were in the same town as he was in at the end of the war. And he was a guy who had a lot of intelligence. I think that that's how he wound up in the 82nd Division headquarters, and he was in charge of mapping. He had secret clearance and things like that. And one of the things he said was he really felt he had the best job at the Army. And it was really just happenstance. The day he was going through induction, the 82nd Airborne had requisitioned for somebody with his skills, and he wound up with the job. And I feel really privileged to have an opportunity to have read the book. I mean, if you give me a business card, I'd be happy to get you a copy of it.
Yeah, thank you for telling us about your father. And did he, if I could ask you, did he talk about his experience very much?
From time to time, but no, he made it not sound like he was ever in difficulty. But he experienced some things that were very difficult. And when he went into Normandy, he was in a glider that crashed, and it was just fortuitous for him. But at the last moment before going in, his seat assignment was changed, and the guy who wound up in his original seat assignment was killed.
I think that the general rule is most of them didn't talk about it. They didn't wish to talk about it. Or if they talked about it, they talked about it elliptically. They talked about it in code. I often heard my father say, "Oh, I didn't do that much in the war, Paul." And I would say back to him, "But you were there, Dad." And he would say, "Yes, I suppose that is so." My father was a flyer, and he landed on Iwo Jima after all those bodies had been severed from their heads, the 1/3 loss. I think he knew what had gone on that black sand, and he was very kind of modest and deferential. But there's no question that my father did brave things and risked his life. 75 missions is 75 risks to your life. Thank you for telling us your story.
Okay, if you give me a card, I'll get you a copy of the book.
Okay, sure. There's a Richard in the back, Richard Cohen, husband of my world-class agent. How's it, a little plug?
Paul, thank you for all of that. This is a kind of technical question. I was always taught, keep the eye, not the eyeball eye, but the ego eye, out of what you write as much as you can. Now, if you're writing a biography, if you know the person you're writing about, you may have to introduce yourself. If you're writing a memoir, it's part of what a memoir is to introduce yourself. But the I, that ego, can either be in self-indulgence or provide an opportunity, and it can sometimes be a necessity. How did you find dealing with that?
Yeah, memory is a different country. The past has another pattern. I'll tell you a story, and I included this in the book to show the faultiness of memory. So I was a young reporter at the Detroit Free Press in the early 1970s. This was 4 or 5 years before I joined the Washington Post, with another stop in between. But in the early 70s, unattached, I took myself on a vacation from Detroit to California, and I wanted to see where I was born, which is at Hammer Field in Fresno, which is where all the Black Widow units trained. That's where they all trained before they went overseas. It's where I was born, at Hammer Field in Fresno. And I had carried with me for decades the fact that I drove around to the back side of Hammerfield in 1972, so this is 3 decades after the war. And Hammerfield had been converted into the commercial airport of Fresno. And there, at the very far back of the field, hanging against the fence, was a rusted out black widow. And my heart is palpitating. Holy damn, a black widow. And I parked my rental car, and I walked over to it, and nobody is looking. And I climbed up into the damn thing. I am now convinced utterly that that never happened.
Memory.
I think another plane was hanging there. You know, I keep sporadic journals like the rest of you writers, and then I abandon them. Maybe some of you write something every day. I have 8 or 10 journals. They stop, they start, they stop. I went and searched out a journal from those years. I am 99.999 sure wasn't a black widow. I had so wanted it to be a black widow. You know, memory is the past. I think Nabokov said that. Memory is another country. The past has another pattern. You have to be very careful. You have to be very careful, which is why I try to ground myself in the facts as much as I can.
And then there's James Dickey.
Oh my God, I knew you'd ask about Dickey. There's a whole chapter in the book of James Dickey and my father. My father and James Dickey crossed paths at Hammerfield in Fresno. He was in a squadron just a few away from my father. You know, James Dickey, one of the great poets of the 20th century, he wrote an immortal poem about the Black Widow called The Firebombing. He aggrandizes himself into the pilot's seat. No, he was in the back as the radar operator. He had washed out of flight school as a pilot, and years later, when he becomes one of America's greatest poets and wrote the novel Deliverance, which became a big mega-seller movie, I'm sure you know it, with Burt Reynolds. I went to Columbia, South Carolina, in the 1970s. This was after the Detroit Free Press, working for a paper called the National Observer. This was before the Washington Post. And I was throbbing with excitement because I was going to get to talk to the great James Dickey, who flew the Black Widow. And he was, I wasn't in his house 5 minutes before he was spooling up the lie. And it was 2 decades after that I found out that no, never did fly the Black Widow. He was in the back. But, you know, critics and would say, who cares? We have the poem. I care that he lied to my face. And you know why? Because in some way that I feel, I can't quite defend this, it may be illogical, but his talking about his daring do exploits piloting the Black Widow, it was as if somehow it was cheapening and making vulgar the risks that my own father took.
Fabulous. One more question.
What do you think your father would say about the book?
Why do these questions have to be so deep? I said the other night, sir, that I think that we underestimate our parents greatly. I think they can stand the truths about themselves. I have sent this book to all my Kentucky kin. They don't want to read about the violence. I mean, so my father was violent to us, but his father was violent to him, and his father's father was violent to him. And Kentucky is full of that. I mean, beating you with tree limbs. We had a saying at the Washington Post, in for a dime, in for a dollar. And what that means, sir, is if you're going to go there, then you have to go there. But this is not a book about whippings. this is a book about the best years of their lives, my mother and my father's, and it's about my father's heroism. So what would he have thought about it? I think he secretly would be proud of me. And he would say, "What the hell did you have to write that thing for?"
On that note, thank you so much. This has been a wonderful book, wonderful conversation.